Hello, my friend. This is Clyde. The Big Two. Matthew 22, verse 36 to 39 says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." A commandment is a clearly worded statement or instruction that is given as a rule and demands obedience. Usually, it is understood that this imperative is absolute, and those who receive a commandment are expected to obey. If obedience to the commandment is demanded, then it makes sense that there is a consequence in disobeying the commandment. The 10 Commandments are a set of rules that God gave Moses to the Hebrew people at that time that God formally made them into a nation. One could say that these commandments formed their constitution as a nation. Let us look at the text and make sense of it. Jesus' earthly ministry was nothing but boring. While he was focused on teaching crowds of people and miracles, dying for the world, there was a constant challenge that came from religious leaders in his community. Rather than focus on the good things Jesus was teaching and doing, they were bent on finding fault with him. They were determined to prove that Jesus was authentic, that he was the Son of God as he claimed to be. These religious leaders knew the law and their religion to the finest details. Their main demonstrated their intention of proving that Jesus was not real. So on one occasion, he had just emerged from a victory battle with one group of show-offs, and one of them, described as an expert, decided to test Jesus further. Which is the greatest commandment in the law? Bear in mind that there are 613 commandments in Jewish law, and children are taught these commandments and expect to live by every one of them by the time they reach the beginning of teenage years. Therefore, Jesus knew the commandments. This man certainly knew the commandments, and so it is set up as a test. Jesus responded in clear terms. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." Let us camp out here for a while. To love God the way it is described here is to adopt a lifestyle of loving God. This brand of love is meant to be only for God. It does not make room for you to love people with such intensity and devotion. To love God like this is to indicate that you know of God and that you know him, and through a personal relationship. You cannot love God unless you know him and that you agree that God deserves to be loved like this. Loving God in this manner becomes a commandment. It's not meant to be something you serve out of obligation. It grows out of a conscious decision to love God for who he is and for what he means to you. Loving God is supreme. There is no greater love relationship than to love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. God himself gave this commandment and requires our obedience. It therefore suggests that God fulfilled the deal by not loving us in a demonstrative way. But catch this. God is so serious about us loving totally that he describes himself as a jealous God. What does that mean? By asking us to love him in such a total manner, God is saying to us that he does not want us to compete with anyone else. It must solely be him and about him. He cannot make that demand because he knows that there is none else beside him who could be worthy of our total love. Also, God has proven that what he does for us and with us. So, your loving him is a sincere to a loving God who wants to have a relationship with each of us. This is the number one, and it is the greatest commandment. It's now your turn to love God with all your being and to love him through a relationship with him. Jesus went on with his answer to the question. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. The first is about love. The second is about love. Love covers it all. But what does Jesus mean by loving your neighbor as yourself? This is always a tricky part because in one section of the Bible, Jesus had to share the story of the Good Samaritan in which he taught us a lesson in loving your neighbor. The story is about a man in need and his own folks walked by and did nothing. Then a man from another ethnic community who did not know this man went to great lengths to help the man who was left on the roadside to die. Jesus went to an extreme story to show us what it means to love our neighbors. Basically, Jesus was saying that your neighbor can be anyone, folks you know and folks you might not know. He's asking us to love people who are nice to you, but your neighbor can be someone who is not nice to you. Love them as much as you want them to love you. To love your neighbor is to go out of your way, to show love by helping, by giving, by caring. That is loving your neighbor as you love yourself. To love your neighbor as yourself means that you go across the road, in a sense, and do for your neighbor the same way you would want him to do for you. This is something to think about. Do you love God? Do you love people in your life? Think about these big two and begin to love God and love the person next door. Totally.